and welcome back to Tiny Artist TV. So for today's video we're going to be continuing our Tea Fairy series, but since I did miss last week's video, we're actually going to be doing a dual prompt. So because these two teas are pretty similar, I figured it'd be cute to do them together, and I'm going to be doing chamomile and lavender tea this week. So instead of doing painting with tea, I'm actually going to be doing a watercolor tutorial this time. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is going to be a little bit less of a tutorial and more of a watercolor tips and tricks while painting alongside. I'm kind of skipping the drawing process. I still have it included and I have it slowed down enough to the point where if you want to draw this particular composition, I'll break down what I'm doing, and of course you can pause the video and get a feel for all the basic shapes that are going to be in this composition. So as you can see here in my thumbnail sketch, I'm starting out with a circular composition, whereas in the previous one I did a square composition that was kind of an open square, and I really like the way that turned out. So this is another one that's going to be kind of an open-ish shape. The border is actually going to be composed of the chamomile and the lavender flowers, but I'm starting out where I want to kind of build that border, and on the inside I'm starting on my fairies. So as you can see here, I'm just kind of using basic shapes to block out the body and just getting the general layout for where I want things to go. Once again, I kind of mess around with the dragonfly wings a little bit more than I need to because they're sticking straight up right now, and I eventually have them downward the way they're supposed to be after I look up a dragonfly reference, and kind of just adding details where I want them to go, because a lot of the details are going to be painted in versus where the lines are. Typically with watercolor, well, not even really typically, because there are a lot of different styles that you can do with watercolor, and of course I feel like the more popular one is the one that doesn't have lines with it, but my strength is my line art. I know my strengths, so I start with a sketch and then I line that sketch and then I color it in with watercolor because that's just the way I like to do things. But if you want to attempt this without line art, be my guest. You're more than welcome to, because it would be your artwork, it would be your style. I'm just here to draw and give some tips and just kind of let you guys into my personal process. So now I'm finishing out with the second fairy. As you can kind of tell, the difference between the first one, it was a little more angular and a little more lean, kind of like a dragonfly would be. And then the one on the left actually made her into this cute chubby little moth girl, so I used a lot of circles and more round shapes to fill her out. So now we're going to get started with the painting. As you can see, I'm using this Winsor Newton watercolor set. I got this as a gift. I think it currently retails for about $35-ish. I personally wouldn't buy this set if it's a really good set. I just wouldn't buy it for myself because I'm broke. So I'm very thankful that someone gave this to me as a gift. But as you can see, it's got a little cup on the side, and the palette extends out so you can actually put your thumb in the middle and hold it. Now I won't be holding it this way for the video because, as you can see, it gets in the way of the frame, so I'm actually going to have this off to the side after I clean the palette off a little bit. So to start, I'm mainly going to be working left to right and working from light to dark, because with watercolor, you do typically want to work from light to dark. It's just like in the tea video, but the exception being that instead of it being one color, you have to be conscious of multiple colors that you're working with if you're not doing a monochromatic piece. And this piece is definitely not going to be monochromatic because it's chamomile and lavender. So it is still going to be a little pastel, but I'm going to be playing a little bit with what I feel like the moonlight would do in this situation. So just to start off, I'm kind of blocking out a little bit of yellow in the middle of the chamomile, and I'm not coloring the entire flower. I'm actually doing what's called stippling, where I'm taking a little bit of the color and I'm intentionally leaving some white spaces where the highest lights would be, and then just kind of stippling a little bit closer together where the darker parts of the line art are and where it's further away from the quote-unquote moonlight. And then I'm going in with some of that darker yellow mixed with a little bit of red to give it this nice orangey color, and just going back over on the darker areas. And now I'm mixing up my greens to just kind of go in between the petals and make some stringy leaves, because chamomile, and I know they look a lot like daisies, is because they're in the same floral family, but the leaves are different. So chamomile leaves are kind of these little stringy tendrils, which works really nice to fill space without it being heavy color. So I'm just taking a little bit of green and making some light strings in between, making almost a daisy chain of chamomile flowers. And because I want the color palette on the left side to be pretty analogous, which means that a lot of the colors are within the same family, I'm using a lot of the orange and the yellow and just kind of blending them together. A little bit of red to make some things darker, or adding a little bit of white to make some things lighter, and again just working from light to dark. But everything on the left hand side is this soft, creamy, dreamy yellow color palette, because chamomile powder is actually, it almost has a greenish tint to it, but it is a nice yellow powder. And of course chamomile tea likewise has that same creamy yellow, almost greenish tone to it. So I wanted to keep everything on the left hand side nice and soft, and this sort of like warm cup of chamomile tea with milk feel to it. As you may have noticed as I'm going along with this painting, is the way that it dries much lighter than you think it would. But that also lets you build up some really interesting color combinations. So previously the wings were, when I was doing the lines across them, looked like a very heavy, very striking beige, whereas now they've dried, they're a little more subtle, and everything allows you as it dries to just really go back over it and build up lovely layers of detail. And just watercolor is very, it can be very forgiving. Now I know it looks like I'm just kind of going through the motions of this because this isn't my first time doing watercolor, but honestly, if this is your first time picking up watercolor, grab a scrap piece of paper and just try some things out. You may be surprised as to how certain colors blend together. Like adding a little bit of red on top of her skin tone doesn't look red. When it dries, it ends up looking like a nice natural blush. Or trying to mix complementary colors so that you get really interesting and rich shadows versus adding, say, black or white to something, which would be a standard way to do kind of lighting and shading. Whereas as you can see here, to make my chamomile flowers darker, instead of adding another layer of darker yellow to add more depth to it, I'm actually going in, I've added a little bit of blue to my green, and I'm adding that in, and when it dries up, it gives it this, again, a really nice rich shadow that just makes the whole thing pop. And what's great about this is that you can actually still see the little bit of darker yellow underneath of that, kind of playing with the green and the blue that's in the watercolor. So everything really builds on itself, unless you can make things too dark to the point of no return, but it takes a lot of paint and a lot of impatience to do that to the point where your paints get muddy. So, excuse me. That's another thing with watercolor is, I know I've talked about this in a couple of my other videos, but painting in the round, kind of going up one way and then back down another way, so that by the time you get back to your starting point is dry and you can work on those layers and build up those colors again. For most of this painting, I've been working with the round brush and my small round detail brush, and I will continue to do so. However, because this background is a large, flat, open background, I'm going to use my flat brush. This also really helps with the grass texture, and again, I'm more or less stippling with this flat brush. As you can see, I'm leaving some areas a little more open, but I'm going back in between places to either darken them up or give the illusion that there are like pips and highlights in this field of grass. And as you can see, it's darker towards the bottom and then a little bit lighter towards where the hills break. To do the clouds, and clouds are kind of a hit or miss, and as far as this one goes, I know it looks like it's starting off well, but I actually do end up changing the sky just a little bit. You kind of want to plan ahead of time where you want your clouds to be. Now, I didn't draw any clouds out because I knew in my head the way I wanted these clouds to look, but if you're starting out or if you're just experimenting with watercolor, just take a very light pencil and kind of sketch out where you want your clouds to be so that you can leave those areas white and then come back in if you want to do a little bit of color. If there are sunset clouds or evening clouds, I'm doing a nighttime scene, so I end up going in with a lot of blue over my clouds, but I do want to leave those white at first so that they are still the lightest areas of my sky when I go back in and paint everything over with the blues and purples that I work into the sky. So now I'm going to get started on the second fairy, which is the Lavender fairy, and I'm going to make her of a darker skin tone. However, I'm starting out with the moth skin tone because I want her wearing tights, but you can still see a little bit of the skin through the tights, but the color is altered a little bit. So I'm blending that yellow with a little bit more red and just a little bit of dark purple to give it a richer tone all over. And it also, having that purple underneath, helps her blend more with the lavender color palette that I give her. So right now I'm, of course, again, just blocking out where I want my lights and shadows to go. I'm leaving my whitest areas white and then going in with the middle range with a one sweep of the brush, and then I go back in on the harshest parts of the shading with another stroke after it's dried a little bit. Because this is a smaller area, it takes less time for it to dry, so I'm able to just go in and kind of immediately block out where I want the shapes on her face to go. And of course, with the lips, I could have done what I did with my moth girl over here and made it a little bit skin tone, but I figured it would be a little more fun to give her a pop of color because everything on the right hand side is very bluish, brownish purple. So to give her that red pop, it just made it a little just made it stand out a little bit more, because I had thought about giving her purple lipstick and I thought that was a little too much. So, of course, if you're painting along with me, it's your fairy. You can give her whatever color lipstick you want. You can make her skin whatever color you want. Just be mindful of how your colors are blending, and if you need a skin tone palette or references for how to blend skin tones, there are plenty of resources online. I tried to look one up to put one in the link, but most of them were Pinterest. They're still useful, but you know, Pinterest tends to have a lot of uncredited resources, and we credit our resources here at Tiny Artist TV. But for the purple, I've actually mixed a little bit of the red tone violet with a little bit of blue to tone it down a bit, and then I mixed it with the white to give it that lavender tone. And now that the skin in the tights is dry, I can go back over and paint her tights. And again, this is a way of just being able to build up colors, because everything is very, yes, it's watery because it's watercolor, but transparent. So because I went ahead and painted the skin on her legs first, now every time I go back in to paint the tights on her legs, you're going to see that skin tone, because it's going to get darker as I build up the purple on the tights. To do the lavender, I actually used the same stippling technique that I used on the chamomile flowers. The only difference being is that I'm more focused on light to dark in regards to, again, where the moonlight is hitting on the center. So I leave most of the front part more white, and I focus starting my stippling in the middle of the flowers, and then doing my heaviest layer of color on the back of the middle to the back of the flower. So again, I start out with the lavender that I have mixed for my fairies clothing, but then I give it a little more of a true lavender feel by mixing in not a darker purple, but blue. And when it dries into the purple, it actually looks more like a dark purple than a blue, even though again, if you're painting along with me, when you first lay it down and you're using that ultramarine, it really does look bright blue, but don't freak out, because it does dry into your first layer and it gives it just a really nice deep purple look. To make the gray for the teacup, I actually use a little bit of that ultramarine mixed with white, and it gives it the illusion of it being a whited shadow, still having a little bit of color to make things a little more round and shiny and pop a little bit. Now, depending on your lighting situation, you may use orange or yellow, but of course, because this is a moonlit scene out in the field, I use blue and white to make the shading on my teacup. For the flowers, I'm actually kind of doing a callback to the series as a whole. So I have on the left-hand side, I actually have a chamomile flower. I have a string of lavender going across the bottom. I have a rose in the middle because I was going to do a rose hips watercolor painting for this series, but I just didn't get around to it. Sorry for you guys who are looking forward to it. Maybe I'll come back to it later. But then on the right-hand side of the teacup, I have an orange blossom, which of course was from our first tea fairy video. now it's time to start the blanket. So what I'm doing first is I'm putting down just a plain wash of water so that my colors spread a little easier and I don't have to worry about more pigment being in one area than another area, versus when I actually go back in, and as you can see I'm doing this stripe pattern. My main focus at first was just getting the color down, and then I can worry about the details when I go back in after the blanket's nice and dried off. So again, what I'm just doing is I'm taking my brush, I'm dipping it into my water and just laying down a nice flat layer, and then I'm taking a little bit of the pigment and making sure that it's smoothed out where I need it to be. Now that everything's dry, I can really go back in and strengthen those lines a little bit more. And I want this to be a plaid pattern. So because this is several layers, I have to wait for it to dry, so I move on to other parts of the painting. Like I work on the stars a little bit and the moon a little bit, as you can see. And after I'm done messing with those, I can come back to the blanket and do the rest of the patterning that I wanted to do on the blanket. Something I forgot to mention earlier, and I think I actually did this in my tea fairy video too, is that if you find yourself having too much water on your paper, what you can actually do is, and I would recommend doing this with a brush instead of a paper towel, because a paper towel can sometimes leave debris on your picture and then you'll get pills of color where you don't want them, but is to take a nice small dry brush and just use that brush as a little mop to just suck up excess water. And it also helps you see what your color is originally going to dry to, because once the water is gone and it's just the pigment that's left over, that's what you're going to see. Just filling in the last little details on the blanket. So this is one of the few exceptions where working dark to light, not necessarily working dark to light because there are still light spots on the blanket, but not really taking care to start with the yellow versus starting with the purple, because it's a plaid, so the colors are going to be overlaid. So now I'm starting on my dragonfly wings. And I start out with, again, a little bit of a wash so that the yellow disperses more evenly. And then I go in with my darker green and add a little bit on the back ends. And then I go in with my yellow to give it a little bit of a stained glass effect. And again, I'm using my dry brush to pick up any excess water. And I'm also using this to help blend the colors back into the wings. I could have done this with a few more colors, but I felt that this was enough. And I'd also been working on this painting for several days at this point and was just really wanting to be done with it. So here we are at the end of our chamomile and lavender painting. I hope you guys found this video helpful and enjoyed watching this video, maybe just listening to the chill music. But yeah, I will see you guys in the next video, which I'm not sure what that's going to be, because May is my birth month and it's going to be full of surprises. So I hope you guys stick around and I'll see you next time. Have a weird day.